Welcome to my first video tutorial. I'm just going to be starting with something relatively simple for my very first video here. This is a badge commission that I got at Furry Equinox, and I'm going to be using watercolor to paint it. So these are relatively simple paintings as far as my art goes. So today the coloring job should only take less than an hour, as opposed to like my full pieces, which could take days or even weeks, and use a lot more layering and different materials. So this is a really good place to start as an introduction to watercolor, at least in the technique that I use. Obviously there's many different techniques that you can use for watercolor. This is just what I found works for me, something that I've developed over years and years of using watercolor. So, let's see, as I go, I'm just gonna demonstrate and describe what I'm doing as I go along. And I'll get more into more advanced techniques and other parts of the process in future videos, but I thought this might be a really great place to start. Kind of get an introduction to how I do my art. So as you can see, I've already sketched and inked this badge. Make sure obviously you're inking with a waterproof ink, because watercolor is very wet and you wouldn't want it to run after you've put so much effort into the nice sketch. I've erased all the sketch lines, and I've put in where I want the markings to be, so so I don't have to be guessing while I'm using the paint. I can just follow my own, coloring in the lines, as it were. So you're going to be wanting to work on a flat surface, not like an easel or anything like that, because watercolor is a lot runnier than a lot of other kinds of paints like oil and acrylic, especially if you're just blocking in a whole lot of light color. That's going to be very water heavy, so you definitely don't want that to be running. Flat surface is obviously ideal. Okay, let's get started with the coloring. I've got my my watercolor palette over here. It's really messy, but that's just kind of how I work. I like to blend my colors into the different shades and hues that I need. Got a couple different sizes of paintbrush. You're gonna want a light watercolor paintbrush. I don't always use all of these, especially for like the simpler stuff like these watercolor badges. Sometimes I'll only use the one. This is a good mid-grade or a mid-size paintbrush. But if you really want to get into more details, you can use the super tiny ones, or you can even use like a really big brush if you want to cover a lot of area. Obviously my water pot. I just use like an old yogurt container or whatever you have hanging around, something you don't mind getting messy. And then I've got my paints. So these are Cotman. I find these to be a fairly inexpensive kind of student grade beginner watercolor. They actually work fantastic. Like, I've recently upgraded to whole beam, and I love these, but I still use the Cotman a lot because they're still really fantastic paint. As you can see, I do use the tube paint rather than the color block. I just like this a lot more because I can control much better the amount of water that I'm using and the with the ratio to the paint. And if I want to get a really dark intense color, I can go almost to using like the pure paint if I want to. So yeah, let's see. So Cuda here, he's a tiger. So I'm just gonna block in the base colors really lightly, and you'll see what I mean as I go. I do like a layering process. So use lots and lots of water. in your first layers. Not too much, because if you use too much water, then it can spread really easily. You're going to still want to be able to control it, but lots of water keeps it nice and light. So let's see. It's going to be kind of orangey yellow in the main areas here. So let's see. And since he's got dark stripes, I don't really mind coloring over the stripes in the orange for now. So yeah, as you can see, this color is just looking still pretty washed out. But we will layer it up and get it more intense as we go. The thing about watercolor is it's a lot easier to go darker than it is to bring out lighter colors later. So I want to start light and then work darker into the shadows. And leave those light areas as the highlights. Okay, super. So now that I've been working on some of the other colors, just blocking them in on their base layer, the orange should be dry, and that means that we can add more layers to it. Because if you go back in and try and paint on an already wet paint, like I said before, it's going to just bleed. You're not going to get any nice sharp lines or anything like that. But we would like to have that. So I'm going to go in with a little bit more intense color, so less water, more paint. And you just kind of have to practice to get a feel for the right ratios. It's not really like a science that I could tell you, exactly 1 part's water, 2 parts paint or something like that. You just kind of have to feel for it and see how dark it goes on the palette. So let's see, I'm just gonna take in my shadow. We're gonna put the shadow on the left here, so the light source is on the right. See, I'm going in with this darker paint, and it's just kind of layering on top. Something I do sometimes is I'll go a lot darker and more intense than I have to with the shadow, and then I can just kind of blend between the shadow and the light and kind of create that middle ground just through the paint that's already on the paper. But you can also just like sorry, you can also just kind of build up a darker and darker layer as you go. Add some fur texture in here. It's got a nice fluffy cheek. blend this out a little bit because it's looking a little too sharp in some areas here. I like it to look nice and sharp where the fur texture is, but if it's just, you know, blending over the muzzle like this here, it's nicer if it's just a little softer. And you'll notice that when you use less water, when you have a more intense color with the paint, it's going to dry a lot faster. So then you can, like, I could probably go back in and do another layer on here, but I'm gonna go into the hair and the other parts just to even everything out so I can see how the whole picture is looking and if I need to go darker in certain places. Something else that I'll do that's kind of unusual is I'll actually use gouache paint and watercolor paint together, like kind of act like they're the same medium. Now, if you're not familiar, gouache paint is just very similar to watercolor paint, but it's a lot more opaque and intense in color. But it works very much the same. You add water, you know, more water makes it lighter, less water makes it more intense. And yeah, I find they work really well together. Like if you're doing watercolor and you find that a lot of the colors are just a little too, you know, too light, too washed out, then you can use a gouache paint instead, and they don't react at all together. They work very nicely as a team. So that is one way that you can actually go in lighter over the dark, is with like a gouache white, maybe mixed in with another color to make it you know, not just white, but you can go in with white opaque gouache on top of darker watercolor or darker gouache. You just have to be very careful about making sure that they don't blend, because, you know, anytime you're going in with a color on top of a different color, they have a risk of blending. So you just have to be very careful that you're layering it on top and not kind of blending it in. When you're using a lot of water, it's easy to make it so that your paint is actually just like enveloped in water, and then like you don't really have a lot of control on your brush, because when you add the paint to it, it's just this big glob of water, and you know, you can put that on the page and it'll just blend with everything, and it's awful. So what I do to control my water is I'll dip the brush in the water, and instead of going straight to the paint, I'll wipe it off a few times on a paper towel. So the more you wipe it off, obviously the less water you're going to have on the brush, and that's how I control how much water I get. I don't like to control it on the palette itself, but rather just on the brush with the paper towel. And now that's another thing that just kind of takes practice to get used to, like, what feels like a lot of water on the brush, how many kind of strokes of the paper towel you need to get it to the right, you know, water content. Just all takes practice. And you just kind of get a muscle memory for it after a while. Okay, now before I go any deeper with some shading, I just want to complete the color blocking on the piece. So that means I'm going to put in some background, just a really easy flat color, kind of black background, maybe a little bit of like loose watercolor texture. So I'll add a lot of water to my paint here because I want to go pretty far with it. Let's see. The nice thing, well, I mean, one of the things I like about watercolor is that it really isn't perfect. It's hard to get a really nice, solid, perfect line or perfect, you know, blend like you might get with markers or something like that, where it's like really deliberate. I kind of like that you get a lot of texture accidentally. You know, you don't have to put a lot of effort in it, and you can get some nice texture just from, you know, the nature of watercolor. Very nice. Okay, so I think I am going to go in one more time and kind of make the shading a little bit darker. Because now that I've got the background in there, it seems, you know, the shading's good, but it could use a little bit more oomph. Okay, yeah, I think this tiger is ready for his stripes. So since this is a darker color, as I mentioned before, you really don't have to worry about it blending into the color below. You can just kind of go for it. So it'll just overpower that color. And as long as the color's dry underneath, they shouldn't be blending together. So you can make a nice sharp line. And one of the nice things about watercolor is, since it is fairly transparent, unless you're using a gouache, you can usually see your lines, like those marking lines I made at the beginning. You can see them still now, even after several layers. Alright, so the stripes that I just made, you can kind of consider that the base layer for the stripes, similar to how we did the thin base layer for all the different colors. So now I'm going to go back in and do just a little bit of shading on the stripes themselves because they're looking a little flat. He's looking pretty cute. So something I'll often do with the simple watercolor badges is I'll go in with some pencil and strengthen up the shading a little bit, just with some like cross hatching and very light pencil strokes. I'm not going to do that here because I was just demonstrating the watercolor techniques. Yeah, I hope you learned something. I'd like to do more videos like this in the future and get into some more techniques that I'm familiar with. I know a lot of people don't really do traditional art anymore, and I'd really like to support more people doing that because you know, it's really fun, beautiful. I love being able to see an original piece, you know, that has the artist's very own hand strokes on it. So if we could have more of that in the world, I would love to be part of the reason. So if you have any suggestions for what to do on next videos, what you're curious about, just drop me a comment, send me an email. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have about the process. Yeah, and if you'd like to subscribe to my Patreon, I do have the full video of this up on there for $10 a month and more subscribers, as well as a lot of other just image-based tutorials that I've already posted there. So you can learn a lot. You don't have to be, you know, a $10 plus a month subscriber to support me and support these videos. You can even just, for $3 a month, I have work in progress is posted there. So you do kind of get to see the behind the scenes and learn a little bit that way as well. Anything that you do pledge is going to go towards my first goal of upgrading my video equipment, because at the moment I'm just filming this on my iPad stacked on a tub of pretzels, so pretty low tech. I would love to upgrade to some better technology, and maybe even move on to doing like some streams and live demonstrations. But yeah, any support is obviously appreciated, and I hope to do more videos in the future. Thanks so much for watching.